Chuck was aware, as I was, that the 4 PhDs thought that we're going to kill Chuck and ruin the airplane.
I could see him coming from back behind me. And as he passed me, I started taking the pictures.
When he called and said that his Mach meter had gone crazy, we all knew what he meant.
The airplane was designed for more G's than a human being could accept.
Pancho had, quote, the rumor had it, had offered a free steak to the first guy to break Mach 1.
In 1947, Chuck Yeager broke the sound barrier by flying a rocket-powered aircraft called the Bell X-1 to a top speed of over 700 miles per hour. In doing so, he opened the skies to supersonic flight and ultimately space travel. But it was anything but easy. Men had died in supersonic attempts. Airplanes were breaking apart in the sky. Brigadier General Robert Cardenas, who flew the B-29 mothership that carried the X-1 aloft.
Now, we knew from World War II experience when some of the pilots, like Chuck in his P-51, chasing a German Me-109 through the skies, when he's going down wide open and approaching the limiting Mach number of the aircraft, the P-51, well, then the whole plane would shake. So they knew they were hitting a barrier, a wall, you might say. And in some cases, when you exceeded that, it could destroy the airplane. So we knew that the effect would be intense enough to destroy the aircraft.
Bob Hoover, backup test pilot for the X-1.
Well, up until the time Chuck made it through the speed of sound, a wall, a barrier, existed in the minds of all of us in aviation. We had seen what could happen to an airplane when it gets into compressibility. We'd never flown an airplane that was designed for that kind of speed. And you got to realize that the design is everything. And the airplanes that we were flying prior to that point, you could see compressibility. We'd photograph it. You could see the shock waves build up and the turbulence occur, and the controllability of the airplane would be limited.
Chief historian at the Air Force Flight Test Center, Dr. Jim Young, explains the limitations researchers faced.
Although there were airplanes on the drawing boards that were, designed to be capable of supersonic flight, nobody really knew if it was possible. There was no flight research available. Wind tunnels were incapable at that time of providing the kind of data necessary to be able to predict what would happen to an airplane in that flight regime. The only way to do it was actually fly it. It was extremely hazardous. The British had decided just a year earlier, after Jeffrey de Havilland's accident, that they would no longer conduct manned research. They were going to use unmanned vehicles to conduct this type of testing.
Brigadier General Charles E. Chuck Yeager, the #1 test pilot for the X-1.
P-51s, P-47s, and 109s, 190s could dive up to about 80% of the speed of sound. As they got into this region, because of their very thick wings going through the air at 80% of the speed of sound, or 0.8 Mach, that additional distance that the air had to travel to go around that wing brought its relative velocity to the surface of the wing up to the speed of sound. And when this occurred, a shock wave formed on the thickest part of the wing and the canopy and other big protrusions on the airplane. And behind these shock waves, you got turbulent air, which causes the airplane to buffet. After realizing that we had a problem because of shock waves and the so-called not being able to approach the speed of sound, that's the reason the whole concept of the XS-1 was conceived. It was to build an airplane to fly in the region of the speed of sound and beyond.
What little was known about supersonic flight came down to this. If you were to punch through the sound barrier, you needed a powerful engine and an airframe sturdy enough to endure the shock waves. These two design parameters were the essence of the X-1. an airframe built like a rock, with engines generating 6,000 pounds of thrust.
I was absolutely convinced from the first time I got exposed to the program that it would be successful. Jack and others convinced me that the airplane was designed for more G's than a human being could accept, and therefore the airplane would hold together.
The X-1, as it was built, they built it in the shape of a 50 caliber bullet, which does go through the speed of sound. But they also built it to withstand 19 G's. To get an idea of what 19 G's mean, airliners flying across the country are built to maybe, I believe, somewhere around 6 or 7 G's. Fighters can pull 9 G's. This thing was built to withstand 19 G's. In other words, really there wasn't going to be anything up there that would tear it apart.
Jack Russell, crew chief for the X-1.
He and Yeager came back to Bell one time to witness an engine run on the rocket engine. They'd never seen the airplane, never heard the engine run. And the two of them were standing over there when I think Dick Frost made the engine run. And I was watching Yeager and Hoover, knowing that they were going to be flying it, and their eyeballs were sticking out, and they're looking at each other like, what are we doing here? You know, we're really going to fly that thing?
Although the X-1 was built on a conventional airframe, its systems were extraordinarily complex. The engine propellants were force-fed by high-pressure nitrogen gas, which also powered the flight controls and the landing gear. Directly behind the cockpit sat the fuel for the 4-chambered rocket engine, a 311-gallon tank of liquid oxygen, and a cylinder of alcohol water. Flight controls, engine controls, and instrumentation surrounded the pilot. Forward visibility on landing was poor. The X-1 did not take off under its own power. Instead, it was carried to altitude by a B-29 and dropped. The pilot had to ignite the rocket engine during this free fall. A successful drop, though, started on the ground.
When the X-1 program came to Muroc Air Base in '46, really, with Bell aircraft, obviously they had to have a facility for loading it under the B-29. And this pit was dug and developed to load the X-1 under the 29. Now, the reason we loaded the X-1 under a B-29 was simple. Number one, the X-1 only had 2.5 minutes of power running all 4 chambers on the motor, and the higher we could drop it, the better off we would be in getting out to higher altitude and high speed. Obviously, if you made a ground takeoff with the X-1 with only 2.5 minutes of power, by the time you got up to 40,000 feet to do your run, you'd be out of fuel. So the X-1 was always dropped from the B-29 with the exception of one ground takeoff that I made in January 1949.
The fierce air battles of World War II made supersonic flight a top priority for the Air Force. And within months of war's end, the X-1 was flying. Testing began in Florida with a series of flights designed to evaluate the rocket plane's basic airworthiness. 2 phases of advanced testing were to follow.
First 6 flights were flown by Jack Willems, a civilian test pilot, and they were glide flights. Dropped out of the B-29 down Pine Castle, Florida, because they didn't have the rocket engine completed. And then after the glide flights were completed, the program was brought to Muroc Air Base with a Bell aircraft detachment of people, a B-29 mothership, and a couple of the X-1s, 6062 and 6063. And Bell started what was called then Phase 1 of the X-1, to take the airplane out to 0.8 Mach number and 20 powered flights to man-rate the rocket system. And they completed that in the late fall of '46 and the spring of '47. And now Phase 2 in the test program, which Bell had was negotiating a contract with the Air Force to complete, called for taking the airplane out to 1.1 Mach.
Mach 1.1, the fastest airplane in the world. The program, however, was not directed by the Air Force, but by the National Advisory Committee on Aeronautics, or NACA, the predecessor to today's NASA. NACA engineers worked hard, but the benefits to the military were significant, and the Air Force, understandably, wanted more control. Colonel Albert Boyd, then head of the Flight Test Division at Wright Field, lobbied hard for Air Force involvement in research flying. Superior flight performance is the key to air combat, and no one knew that better than military pilots. Research projects such as the X-1 should be Air Force projects, Boyd argued. The sooner Air Force pilots had supersonic jets, the better.
General Boyd is frequently called the father of modern Air Force flight testing, and for good reason. He took over as chief of the old Flight Test Division at Wright Field in 1945. He immediately set about to create a new order of things. He was very much concerned about building an organization which would have pilots who were capable of conducting experimental research flying. Now, up until that time, that type of flying was largely the preserve of the old National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, and to some extent the contractor pilots.
The Flight Test Division at Wright Field did a lot of flight test work. We did all the stability control in the new airplanes, performance flight testing, weapons development, and things like that, but we had never been exposed to research flying. NACA, the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, was given the charter for research, and they had been working with Bell Aircraft Company on the instrumentation and the whole X-1 program. When Bell began to kind of drag their feet and getting into a flap about bonus money, Colonel Boyd, who was chief of the Flight Test Division, he saw an opportunity to get the military involved in research flying. And Colonel Boyd went to the engineering division back there of the old Air Material Command and said, hey, you know, we've got military test pilots who are a hell of a lot better than the civilian test pilots flying the airplane. We could probably do a much better job and do it a lot cheaper, because military guys do their flying for it's their duty.
Boyd got his X-1, but it was a complex deal. Yeager and Hoover, Air Force pilots, would fly the X-1 through the sound barrier, but NACA would be in charge of collecting the flight data. The Air Force would take only one of the X-1s, NACA the other. It was fair, but still, each partner felt the other needed controls.
We were in an accelerated program with the #1 X-1, and like if we'd gone 0.88 Mach on this flight and sat down and post-flight briefed it and didn't run into any serious problems, really, I'd say to Ridley, said, well, why don't we smoke it on out to about 9.2 or 9.3 on the next flight? NACA is, you know, don't do it, don't do it, don't do it. And they'd come up like, if we went 8.8, they'd say, you know, 0.9 is about the maximum we should go to. And it is really a very conservative outfit.
Walter Williams, chief engineer for NACA.
General Boyd, or Colonel Boyd at the time, had a belief that nobody should be doing testing but his flight test group. That these contractors shouldn't be doing the testing and so forth. And he was a little ambivalent about NACA. Later he changed. He and I became very good friends. So it was agreed that they would take on an accelerated program. We would take on the detailed research program. And, but that we would also have technical surveillance over the Air Force program. Because we didn't want them to go out and, you know, they had a hell-bent for leather attitude quite often. And we didn't want to waste these pretty airplanes.
This is the high desert north of Los Angeles. It is a region of ancient lake beds ringed by the majesty of California's Sierra Nevadas. An ideal place for flight testing, the skies are open and it's flying weather almost year-round. In 1947, though, This was a dusty, wind-blown outpost called Muroc Air Base, then only partially in use. Muroc was here because it had what no other facility in America offered: Rogers Dry Lake, 26 miles of hardened lake bed on which any aircraft could land from almost any direction. This was invaluable because the X-1's landing gear could not support the aircraft's full weight. Pilots had to dump their fuel and land without power. The lake bed provided a welcome margin of error. Because of it, Boyd transferred his entire team from the comfortable world of Wright Field to Muroc. Later, Muroc would become Edwards Air Force Base, the crown jewel of flight testing. But in 1947, housing was minimal and life was harsh.
We knew we were going out to California to the desert to test the airplane, and it just kept getting more desert and more desert all the way out until we got near the North Lake bed. There were no roads then into the base at all from the north. So there was just a sand road off of 58 that the guy that was driving knew where it was, and we went across that little sandy stretch of road and dropped down onto the lake bed. There he stopped to let everybody look, and you could see mirages all over the place like we were going into water, and the buildings were all waving around. And he said, "That's where you're going to live down there, where you see that big lump of dark stuff." And one of the guys said, "Would you turn this car around and take me back to Barstow?" He said, "I'd like to go home."
It was pretty desolate. And when the wind would blow, it would blow strong. And it was dusty and uncomfortable. And you were in isolation, just no question about it. There wasn't a lot of activity. We'd get up and fly when we had something to fly, or visit around the engineering offices.
To be stationed at Muroc, in my opinion, as a caretaker, was probably the worst job in the Air Force. And the people they had here fit that description. And so consequently, when I came out here in 47 on the X-1 program on temporary duty and brought Glennis out here a little later, see, I wasn't authorized housing. She wasn't authorized to use the commissary or any of the facilities on Muroc Air Base.
As isolated as they were, the X-1 team was understandably desperate for a place to let off steam. Ironically, they found what they needed just a few miles from the base, and they met Pancho Barnes. These are what remain of the place Pancho called Rancho Oro Verde, better known, though, by the name Jimmy Doolittle gave it, the Happy Bottom Riding Club. Pancho was one of the world's most accomplished aviators. She held the woman's world speed record, and she had flown stunts for movie producers like Howard Hughes. Heiress to the San Marino Lowe's fortune, Pancho grew up in a household that knew industrialists and movie stars, but she was eager for a life of aviation, animals, and the freedom to be herself. In 1935, she bought a parcel of land in the high desert and began a life that suited her well. She farmed, built an airstrip, and added one building after the other. In short order, she had a thriving desert resort that was a favorite for Hollywood, industrialists, and for the test pilots. As fellow aviators, Yeager, Hoover, and the X-1 team were welcome at Pancho's. They swam in her pool, rode her horses, drank at her bar, and talked flying with this interesting woman who knew airplanes as well as they did. Pancho became a trusted friend to the men of Mach 1.
She's a very generous, nice woman, and smart. She knew a hell of a lot about airplanes and was interested in what we were doing. And we, in turn, she was kind of a gold mine of information about the old Tom Thumb races and the old days of the Travel Air mystery ships and how they flew them. See, we were a military guy. We were, true blue military. What we were, the Air Force had taught us, and our job was to fight. We really had never had the chance to have fun in airplanes, just fly them for fun. We were always working or fighting.
I always have called Pancho's place kind of the recreational sanctuary for the test pilots here at Edwards. It was at Pancho's place where these guys would go to celebrate their victories and sometimes to mourn their losses. It was at Pancho's where they would sit at a bar over a few drinks and kind of talk shop and talk the business, and certainly relieve a great deal of the stress with which they lived. Again, these guys were flying constantly, and it's hard for us to conceive of the kinds of schedules they maintained. They were in and out of cockpits. The desire to get the airplanes tested and get them out of here was very intense. It was a very accelerated kind of environment, and the flying was very dangerous. You were living constantly with the knowledge that next time your number could come up.
It was not an idle fear. Flight testing was a dangerous business. Yeager, Hoover, and other test pilots purposely flew their aircraft into regions of known instability. What they learned could save the lives of pilots down the line, but the tests themselves often ended in catastrophe. Dr. Young studied the data.
Between 1945 and 1956, there were 31 fatal accidents by conservative estimate. And I say that because the records are very, very incomplete. And I've seen published sources, not official records, which suggest that the numbers were at least twice, if not 3 times that rate. 31 fatal accidents for which the Air Force carried responsibility. That did not include contractors, that did not include the NACA. I have to think there were more than that. In the year 1948, there were 13 fatalities alone.
Test pilots can't survive without a keen sense of judgment. While the objectives of a flight and the maneuvers to be flown can be written on the test card they carry aloft, executing the card safely was the responsibility of the pilot.
An engineer can hand you a flight test card, and he's only thinking in terms of that phase of testing that he wishes to accomplish without consideration for all the other facets of the airplane's design capability. So you can be handed a card that could get you into potential trouble. And so the trick to stay alive was to understand what was being requested of you and what ramifications would that have on the overall design of the airplane, whatever its capabilities might be. And if you go out and exceed it, you can lose part of the airplane or your life. And that happened quite a few times.
An engineer knows theory. A pilot knows hardware and a result of theory. Basically, during the X1 program, see, what I inherit or get the knowledge from an engineer like Ridley, and then I mix it with an airplane, and the end result is it either does or it doesn't. So, and the pilot usually, if you want to save your neck, you better know about what's going on, see, with the hardware as well as theory.
Boyd picked 3 engineers who would keep his pilots alive: Jack Russell, Dick Frost, and the one who would be Yeager's close confidant, Jack Ridley. Jack Russell, the crew chief, had come to the Air Force from Bell Aircraft and had been with the X-1 from its first days. His intuitive feel would keep the program moving despite the X-1's many mechanical quirks. Dick Frost, also from Bell, was the engine man. If a problem cropped up in the air, it would likely be with the rocket motor, and Boyd wanted Frost there as Yeager's wingman. Frost flew low chase next to the B-29 on each of the flights. Jack Ridley was the X-1's flight engineer. Few could match his credentials. Quiet and soft-spoken, he was a superb test pilot and held a postgraduate degree from Caltech. The pilots believed in Jackie. They trusted his opinions. In the end, it was Ridley that hit upon the solution to supersonic controllability. His modification to the X-1 forever changed aircraft design. The team's first 5 flights were unremarkable. On the 6th, though, Yeager encountered the same control problems others had discovered near the sound barrier.
Basically, you remember I talked about the P-51 running into buffeting at about 0.8 Mach number because the wings were so thick. Well, obviously, the thinner the wing, the less distance the air has to go around the wing. So consequently, the higher Mach number that wing can go to before a shock wave will form on it. And since the X-1 wing and horizontal stabilizer was about 1/3 as thick as a P-51 wing or P-47 wing, it didn't get into buffet until we got out to about 0.88 Mach number. And basically it was the same kind of buffeting and instability that we experienced in the P-51 in World War II. During the flight test program in the X-1, at the end of each run, and this gets a little bit technical, at the end of each run, I would roll the airplane over and pull about 3 Gs at that maximum Mach number. And the reason I did with this was that we had learned in flying P-84s and P-80s, you could take these airplanes out to their critical Mach number, which in the case of the P-80 was 0.8, and a shock wave would form in the airplane and it would begin to buffet. Well, if you slowed the airplane up to about 7.7 Mach number, where the airplane flew smooth, and pulled 3 Gs with it, it got into the same buffeting there at 7.7 Mach number and 3 Gs that it did at 0.8 Mach number and 1 G.
So as he made this 3G turn, he began to get a pitch, an oscillation. So when he came down and reported that to Jackie and Dick, they said, well, very definitely what's happening is the shock wave is traveling across the surface of the horizontal stabilizer, and when it's hitting the hinge point where the elevator hinges on the horizontal stabilizer, it's blanking out the elevator, and therefore Chuck is beginning to lose control. So Dick Frost brought up the point that when the ship was designed, they fixed it so that you could move the leading edge of the horizontal stabilizer up and down, but you couldn't do it in flight. On the ground, you could adjust it to 1 degree up or 1 degree down, lock it in, and then you flew with it in that position. So the idea was to connect it up.
And the way we did it, the leading edge of the horizontal stabilizer was tied into a jack screw that was run by an air motor on top and an air motor on the bottom. And I could control that air motor from a solenoid switch up on the control column and run this top motor. It would turn the screw one way and move the leading edge down on the horizontal stabilizer, or reverse it and go back up the other way. Now, we had never used this system in flying the X-1 out to 0.94 Mach number. We'd lock the horizontal stabilizer in at about 1 or 2 degrees leading edge up, and that's where it stayed all the time during our flight test program. Well, Ridley and we discussed it at great length, decided that maybe we should try to control the airplane with the horizontal stabilizer. So we went out and got with Jack Russell, our crew chief, and took the panels off the vertical stabilizer where this jack screw and motors was, squirted a lot of 3-in-1 oil on it and got it to working, and this got the system down to where it seemed to work pretty good.
A flying tail. It was a profound intellectual and engineering leap. There had been nothing like it in aviation. Yeager, as the pilot feeling the shock waves as they moved across the stabilizer, knew that Ridley's modification would work. NACA engineers, though, disagreed and argued against the tail modification. It was potentially a matter of life or death. Colonel Boyd let the team decide.
Chuck was aware, as I was, that the 4 PhDs there thought that we're going to kill Chuck and ruin the airplane, lose the airplane. And so I commented on the fact. I said, well, if Ridley's right, you're going to be a hero, but if he's wrong, you're going to be dead, Chuck. And all he said was, if Jackie thinks I can do it, I'll do it.
The Mach 1 team tested the modification on the next 2 flights. Mechanically, it worked. Whether it would do its job under the stress of the shock wave was another matter. Fate, however, had a mind of its own, and the sublime achievement of Mach 1 had to await a bout of irony. It came in the form of a horse and a gate, and a night at where else? Pancho's. Chuck Yeager and Mac McKendry, aviator and Pancho Barnes' husband.
And he had a fall arm on the gate that fell down in here. In fact, the old leather lock is still there after 50 years.
They don't deteriorate, no dry desert.
Yeah, this gate normally would open out, and it opened up the whole desert over to the knolls. And Glennis and I was on Sunday night. We went over there for dinner. We got a babysitter out there. I think we had Carol Zabrowski babysitting the 2 kids, and we went out and had dinner, and then it's pretty night, so we took a couple of Pancho's horses and went riding, which we'd done before. We were out riding at night. There was enough starlight and stuff like that to see what we were doing, and we were racing coming back really, and somebody closed the gate, and I was in the lead, and it's hard to see the gate, but I was almost on it before I saw it was closed, and bent the horse, but he went through actually missed the gate, hit the barbed wire fence, and flipped, and I landed on my right side and broke a couple ribs, and that's just about the way it happened, really. And we caught the horse and took it on in. It was cut up a little bit from the barbed wire, and went on home. So, and we made our flight Tuesday morning. So it gave me a whole day. Ridley and I talked it over with him and said, I got a problem, and that's how he came up with. I just couldn't close the door. We got in the X1, and he held the door, and I tried to close it. I couldn't close it because of the pain in my right side, and he's the one that came up with the stick to put in the door handle. Gave me, I could do it with my left hand. And once you get in the airplane, you can still fly it. It doesn't make any difference. And I looked at it, and I figured I wouldn't be hindered by flying that way, so I went ahead and flew.
My problem in the B-29 was if I raised the nose gear more than about 11 or 12 inches on takeoff, I would scrape the tail of the X-1 and create sparks. That combination like a bomb.
If anything happened to the B-29 like an engine fire or engine failure, we'd have to get rid of the X-1, and we always wanted to be within gliding distance of the lake bed in case we jettisoned the X-1 out of the B-29.
When they heard the sharp double crack of the sonic boom, although they didn't realize it, they were actually witnessing the dawn of the space era.
The day finally came. October 14th, 1947. Yeager, Ridley, Hoover, Frost, Cardenas, and Russell assembled on the lake bed and made ready. It was 10 a.m. The sky was a perfect blue. The morning winds were calm. The question, though, remained unsettled. Would the X-1 make it through the wall, or would it break apart and kill Yeager with it?
Well, I remember that morning very well. Chuck and I were sitting, and I had a 46 Ford Coupe, and we were sitting in the car out of the cold and waiting for the airplane to be fueled. And we got out of the car, and somebody gave Chuck the signal. So then I went to my airplane for launch, and Chuck climbed aboard the B-29 as they moved it out from the pits.
Cardenas taxied the B-29 onto the runway and pushed his throttles forward. To avoid scraping the X-1, he used a gentle three-point takeoff, all 3 wheels pulling off at the same time. Hoover and Frost followed in their chase aircraft. They flew into position, one high for Yeager to aim at, one low to watch the rockets ignite.
I was up above 40,000 feet. And it would be easy for Chuck to spot me because I would be leaving a large plume or contrail. And so when he'd separate from the mothership, he'd aim for that contrail. And that'd put him in the right location towards the return for landing on the lake bed.
Somewhere around 10 to 12,000 feet in altitude, I moved back into the Bombay of the B-29 with Jack Ridley and got on a ladder, and they let the ladder down by the side of the nose of the X-1, and I'd usually slide in feet first into the cockpit of the X-1, and once I was in the cockpit of the X-1, then Ridley would bring the door down and hold it against the side of the X-1, and I would lock it on from the inside. And once you got into the X-1, of course, then I had to get my helmet on, an oxygen mask, and get tied into the radio or communication system with the B-29 pilot, and then I started through a checklist.
Cardenas maintained a climb until he reached 25,000 feet. From there, he went into a shallow dive and accelerated to 250 miles per hour, the X-1's drop speed. Once dropped, Yeager made an irreversible commitment. The X-1 had no ejection seat, and even if he could push through the hatch, the wings were waiting like blunt-edged knives.
Once he leveled the airplane out and counted down to the drop, Jack Ridley would have moved back up into the cockpit, into the co-pilot seat of the B-29, and Jack always dropped or pulled the lever that released the bomb shackle that dropped the X-1 out of the B-29. It really wasn't any different for me than the other flight. It just a matter of hanging on, keeping the airplane headed the right direction. When I looked at and watching the Mach meter, since we relied on that instrument, you know, because everything was happening in relationship to the speed of sound. Once we got the airplane up and it got beyond the speed of sound, obviously all the buffeting quit, and the Mach meter jumped because the shock wave passed over the pitot tube where you get your measurements from, the static and impact pressure. And I just looked at it and it was a surprise to me, and I really didn't, you know, you're in an environment, but you don't have any thoughts about, you know, this is great or all that stuff. You're too busy watching the systems, keeping the pressure chamber up on your rocket motor and watching all the systems. And I just made the comment to Jack that the thing had passed off the scale. He said, we'll, you know, fix it. That's about all he said. As the airplane went through about 9.5 or 9.6 Mach number, the nose began to drop on the airplane because these shock waves were moving back and the center pressure was moving back on the wing, and the airplane, all I did was crank the leading edge down on the horizontal stabilizer to keep the nose up, and as we went through Mach 1, the nose began to come up, and I cranked the leading edge up on the horizontal stabilizer with the jack screw and the air motors, and drove it through the Mach 1.
I could see him coming from back in the back behind me. And as he passed me, I started taking the pictures. And that was the first photo we had in flight of the diamond shock waves with us, like this, out the back of the airplane. The picture turned out real good, and it was flown overnight and was on President Truman's desk the next morning, which was pretty spectacular.
I used to orbit over the base in the B-29 because he was making his turn out around Santa Barbara, and he kind of needed a reference point so he could see us. You know, he's got eyesight like an eagle. I think he can see a deer 2 miles away on a mountain ridge, so he could spot us and have a reference point to come back.
I don't recall that there was very much chatter because when Chuck headed back, I would start downhill to try and be with Low Chase, who was Dick Frost, on that particular day. And I was headed for the lake bed just to keep up with him, but there's no way you could get a P-80 down. The airplane was just too speed limited. And the X-1 would drop like a rock if you point the nose downhill. But Chuck set up his pattern and landed beautifully as always.
We didn't have media all over the place. And so he's sitting out there on the lake bed. We had to send a dusty old Jeep out there to hook onto the X-1 and tow him in. That's how he came back, was standing on the wing of his X-1, where he had just done something the first time in the world.
Flight number 9 broke the sound barrier. Ridley's flying tail had worked. From separation until landing, the entire run took just 14 minutes. Yeager reached an altitude of 43,000 feet and achieved the top speed of Mach 1.05, or 700 miles per hour. He was supersonic for 20 seconds. Most could not or did not hear the double clap of the sonic booms, one off the nose, the other off the tail. Others heard it clearly.
Well, that day, of course, we heard it at the ranch. We heard the boom and it went out. And we assumed that was a sound barrier because they'd been talking about we'd probably hear something when they went through the sound barrier. We didn't hear that much. And so that evening, they come over. They'd been around the base some, but they came over. It's kind of hard to remember now, but I'd say possibly by 7 o'clock in the evening. And there was about 7 or 8 of them with Chuck. And Chuck got up on the bar and was sitting there, one foot up on the bar like this, and he's leaning against the wall back of him, and the other feet hanging over the side of the bar, and everybody was toasting him, including Pancho and I. We were toasting him too, and so glad that it was successful.
We were kind of jumping around up there in the control tower when he said his Mach meter went crazy, and whether there was a boom or not, I don't know. But we knew what he had done anyway, and that was a happy moment.
We straight-lined it, beelined it to Pancho's, and the fun started. And none of us were aware that there was any secrecy associated with it. So the cat was really out of the bag by the time we were told that it was hush-hush. I always thought it was a disappointment that it happened that way, because it wasn't until many years later that Chuck got the due recognition that he so well deserved and should have had early on as compared to when it did occur. But it was a great event.
Pancho had, quote, the rumor had it, had offered a free steak to the first guy to break Mach 1, and we went over and collected. We collected more than we earned, but she didn't mind.
It was something that occurred at a time and space that I guess was sort of meant to be.
Now that is a really big breakthrough that came out of the whole X-1 program, was finding out that if you wanted to drive an airplane through Mach 1, you had to be able to control the horizontal stabilizer or develop a flying tail, as we call it.
Well, it was a great adventure, I'll say that. I've only had that feeling several times in my life, and that was one of them. Another one was when I was driving between Orlando and the Cape, and knowing that before I left the Cape, we will have launched John Glenn.
Today, fighter pilots slip back and forth across the sound barrier with little thought. In 1947, though, it was an impenetrable wall. Knowing its deadly history, what motivated the Mach 1 team? Did they foresee Neil Armstrong walking on the moon, a war won faster? Or did they see it the way a high jumper sees a high jump? Just another bar.
Chuck didn't do this because he thought he was going to be a hero. You got to know Chuck. He did it because it was there. That X-1 was sitting there. Somebody had to fly it. He wanted to fly it. He had no thought in terms of, I'm going to be a hero. He just wanted to fly that thing. It was a piece of machinery that he wanted to tackle.
A great adventure, a team of extraordinary men, determined to do just one thing. They broke the sound barrier because it had to be done. It has been 50 years since that October morning, and still, pilots know who these men are. In their presence, they grow quiet with respect. The Mach 1 team. October 14th, 1947.